Harlem did not sleep the way other places slept. It rested with one eye open, listening to footsteps that didn't belong and voices that carried the wrong kind of confidence. The streets remembered everything, every promise broken, every man taken, every silence that meant more than words ever could. And in a place where memory was currency, one name still held its value no matter how many seasons passed. Bumpy Johnson. He wasn't loud. Harlem had enough loud men who filled rooms with noise and left nothing behind but echoes. Bumpy was different. He moved like a thought you couldn't shake, like something steady in a world that refused to be. People didn't follow him because he demanded it. They followed him because when he spoke, things changed, and not in ways that brought chaos, but in ways that restored something people thought they had lost. Respect. Had been years since. The last time Harlem truly felt like it belonged to its own people. Power had shifted in quiet ways, the kind that didn't make headlines, but made life heavier. Officials came through with polished shoes and practiced smiles, promising order, while delivering control. Police walked the streets not as protectors, but as reminders of who held authority and who was expected to lower their gaze. And then there were the small humiliations. A man stopped for no reason other than being in the wrong place, at the wrong time, which was anywhere. A shop owner fined into silence. A young boy learning too early that his dignity was negotiable in the eyes of those who had never earned it. These weren't accidents, they were patterns. And patterns, Bumpy knew, were never random. That morning the air carried something heavier than usual. Bumpy sat by the window of a modest office above a storefront, watching the street like a man reading a language only he understood. Across from him sat Dutch Schultz, composed as always, his presence calm but unmistakable. Dutch didn't fidget. He didn't interrupt. He simply observed, his sharp eyes taking in the rhythm of the city below. "You feel it?" Dutch asked. Quietly, his voice smooth, controlled. Bumpy didn't answer immediately. He let the silence stretch, not out of hesitation, but out of precision. Words to him were tools. You didn't use them unless you knew exactly what they would build. "Yeah," Bumpy said finally. "Something's out of place." Dutch nodded slightly, as if that confirmed something he already suspected. "It's not just the streets," he added. "It's the way people are moving, too careful, too quiet." Bumpy leaned back in his chair, folding his hands in his lap. "Fear doesn't show up all at once," he said. "It leaks in." And it had. Over the past week, small things had started happening. Nothing loud, nothing dramatic. Just enough to be noticed by those who paid attention. A man who ran a corner store was suddenly under investigation for irregularities. A teacher was questioned about associations she didn't have. A delivery driver was stopped 3 times in one day, each time for a different excuse. Individually, they meant nothing. Together, they meant everything. Someone was applying pressure, not the kind that breaks bones, but the kind that bends people slowly, until they forget what standing straight feels like. Bumpy stood, adjusting his coat with the same calm precision he applied to everything else in his life. "Let's walk," he said. Dutch didn't ask where. He simply stood and followed. The streets greeted them like they always did, not with cheers or spectacle, but with acknowledgement. A nod here, a glance there. Subtle signs of recognition that meant more than applause ever could. They passed a group of young men gathered on a corner, their conversation cutting off just slightly as Bumpy approached, not out of fear, but out of respect. One of them, no older than 20, stepped forward. "Mr. Johnson," he said, his voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of something else. "They picked up Mr. Ellis this morning." Bumpy stopped. Mr. Ellis wasn't just another name. He was a quiet man. Bookkeeper, churchgoer, the kind of man who kept records clean and his head down. The kind of man who believed that if you did everything right, the world would eventually treat you fairly. "What for?" Bumpy asked. The young man shook his head. They didn't say. Just took him. Bumpy's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes sharpened. Where? Precinct on 125th. Bumpy nodded once, then continued walking. Dutch glanced at him. You think it's connected? Bumpy didn't answer right away. He didn't need to. They both already knew Dot by the time they reached the precinct. The sun had climbed higher, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch across the street like warnings. The building itself stood tall and indifferent, its presence a reminder of authority that rarely needed to explain itself. Inside, the air was thick with the kind of tension that came from too many unanswered questions. An officer behind the desk looked up as Bumpy approached. His expression shifted not to respect, but to something more cautious. Can I help you? The officer asked. Bumpy met his gaze evenly. I'm here about Mr. Ellis. The officer leaned back slightly, as if considering how much truth he was willing to offer. Ongoing investigation, he said. You'll have to wait. Bumpy nodded, as if that was exactly the answer he expected. Then I'll wait. He said Dot, and he did. Minutes passed. Then more. Dutch remained beside him, silent, composed. The room seemed to adjust around them, the usual noise dimming just slightly as people became aware of their presence. Finally, a door opened. Mr. Ellis stepped out. His coat was wrinkled, his glasses slightly crooked. But it wasn't his appearance that mattered, it was his posture. He looked smaller, not physically. Something else. Something that had been pressed down. Bumpy walked toward him, his steps measured. You all right? He asked. Mr. Ellis hesitated, then nodded. Yes, I'm fine. But his voice said otherwise. Bumpy studied him for a moment, then turned back toward the desk. What was the charge? He asked. The officer shrugged. Nothing stuck. Bumpy held his gaze a second longer than necessary, then nodded again. Good, he said simply. He turned and walked out, Mr. Ellis and Dutch following. Outside, the noise of Harlem returned, but it felt different now, like a performance over something real. Bumpy stopped on the sidewalk. They wanted him seen, he said. Quietly. Dutch nodded. Message, yeah, Bumpy said, but not just to him. He looked down the street, his expression calm but his mind already moving. They're testing, he continued, seeing how far they can go before somebody pushes back. Dutch crossed his arms slightly, and Bumpy's gaze hardened not with anger, but with certainty. They just found the line. And somewhere, not far from where they stood, a man who had been gone for 11 years was beginning to understand that Harlem hadn't forgotten, and neither had the man who protected it. Harlem had a way of holding its breath without anyone noticing at first. It didn't happen all at once. There was no signal, no announcement, no single moment you could point to and say, that's when everything changed. It was quieter then. It lived in the spaces between conversations, in the way laughter ended just a little too early, in the way doors were closed a second faster than before. And if you had lived there long enough, if you had learned to read the city the way some men read books, you understood that silence like that wasn't peace, it was warning. The morning after Mr. Ellis was released, the streets didn't look any different. The same vendors called out to passing customers. The same buses groaned as they carried tired people to places that rarely rewarded their effort. And the same music drifted from open windows like a stubborn kind of hope. But underneath it all, something had shifted. People were watching more carefully, not just the police, not just the officials. Each other. Bumpy Johnson noticed it immediately. He stood again at that same window, hands resting lightly behind his back, his posture relaxed but his attention absolute. From where he stood, Harlem unfolded like a living map, every movement a piece of information, every pause a question waiting to be answered. Dutch Schultz sat nearby, as composed as ever, flipping a matchstick between his fingers without ever looking down at it. They're looking over their shoulders now. Dutch said, not as an observation, but as confirmation. Bumpy didn't turn. Because somebody wants them to. Dutch leaned back slightly. Mr. Ellis wasn't the target, he said. No, Bumpy replied. He was the example. And examples were powerful. Not because they broke people, but because they showed everyone else how easily it could happen. Bumpy turned then, his eyes steady, his expression unreadable. Find out who's been asking questions, he said. Dutch raised an eyebrow slightly. About Ellis? About everything, Bumpy said. People don't get pulled in like that unless someone points a finger first. Dutch stood without another word. He didn't ask how far to go or how careful to be. He understood the balance. Bumpy operated within truth without chaos, control without cruelty. And that balance was what made Bumpy different from every other man who claimed to lead. Hours passed, and Harlem continued its quiet performance. But by late afternoon, the first crack appeared. It came in the form of a name, not spoken loudly, not announced, just passed carefully from one trusted voice to another, until it reached the one man who needed to hear it. Bumpy listened without interrupting as Dutch relayed what he had learned. The information wasn't dramatic. It didn't come with proof tied neatly together. But it had weight, the kind of weight that comes from consistency. Same name keeps coming up, Dutch said. Different places, different people, same shadow. Bumpy nodded slowly. How long? Dutch hesitated, just slightly. Long enough that people stopped talking about him. That was the part that mattered. In Harlem, people didn't forget easily. Names lingered. Stories stayed alive long after the men in them disappeared. So when a name stopped being spoken, it usually meant one of two things. The man was gone for good, or he had done something that made people want to forget he ever existed. Bumpy walked across the room, his steps unhurried. Say it, he said. Dutch met his gaze. He used to be close to you. The room didn't react, the walls didn't shift. But something in the air tightened, like the city itself had leaned in to listen. Bumpy's expression didn't change. What's his name? He asked. Dutch didn't soften it. Marcus Hawley. For a moment, nothing moved. Not the street outside, not the dust in the air, not even the sound of the city pressing against the windows. Because Marcus Hawley wasn't just a name. He was a memory. And not the kind that faded with time. He had been part of the inner circle once, not by force, not by fear, but by trust. The kind of trust that isn't given easily and isn't broken without consequence. He knew how things worked. He knew who mattered. He knew where the lines were drawn, and more importantly, where they weren't. And then, 11 years ago, he vanished. No goodbye, no explanation. Just gone. At the time, there had been whispers, quiet ones, careful ones, the kind that never fully formed into accusations, but never disappeared either. Deals that went wrong. People who got caught in situations they shouldn't have been in. Information that seemed to reach the wrong ears at exactly the wrong time. Nothing proven, but enough to remember. Bumpy finally spoke. He didn't just disappear, he said. Dutch nodded. No, he ran. Looks that way. Bumpy walked back to the window, his reflection faint against the glass. And now he's back, he said. Dutch folded his arms, quietly. That's the part I don't like, Bumpy replied. Because men like Marcus Hawley didn't return quietly unless they believed they had something protecting them, or someone. The next few days unfolded like a slow tightening of a noose. Only no one could see who it was meant for. More incidents. A shop owner. Fined again, this time for something so minor it barely made sense. A young man questioned on his way home, held long enough to make sure everyone noticed. A family threatened with eviction over paperwork that had been perfectly fine the week before. Each event, on its own, was small, but together they painted a picture. And Bumpy Johnson didn't look at pictures without asking who painted them. One evening, as the sun dipped low enough to cast Harlem in shades of gold and shadow. Bumpy made his move, not loud, not sudden, just deliberate. He chose a place where information moved as easily as air errant, tucked just far enough off the main street to feel private, but close enough to stay connected to the pulse of the neighborhood. It wasn't fancy, but it didn't need to be. The kind of place where people talked freely because they believed they weren't being listened to. Bumpy arrived alone. That, more than anything, drew attention. He didn't sit in the back. He didn't hide in a corner. He took a table where he could see the room and be seen by it. He ordered coffee, nothing more, and let it sit untouched as he observed. Minutes turned into an hour, then another. And slowly, the room began to change. People noticed him. Then they noticed each other noticing him. And eventually, someone made a mistake. A man at the far end of the room, well-dressed, careful in his movements, stood up just a little too quickly when Bumpy's gaze passed over him. Not enough to draw attention from anyone else, but enough. Bumpy didn't react immediately. He let the man move, let him pay, let him head toward the door. Only then did Bumpy stand. He walked at the same pace he always did, unhurried, controlled, as if time itself adjusted to him rather than the other way around. The man reached the door. Bumpy reached him. Marcus. The name landed softly, but it hit like truth always does, direct, unavoidable. Marcus Hawley froze. For a second, he didn't turn, and in that second, everything about him was revealed, not through action, but through hesitation. Then, slowly, he faced Bumpy. 11 years had changed him. Time always did, but it hadn't changed the way his eyes moved, quick, calculating, searching for exits even when none were visible. Bumpy, Marcus said, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Didn't expect to see you here. Bumpy studied him, not with anger, not with warmth, just with clarity. You weren't supposed to, Bumpy replied. Marcus chuckled lightly, but it felt thin. Been a long time. Yeah, Bumpy said, it has. A pause, not awkward, not empty. Heavy. Marcus shifted slightly. Look, I didn't come back to cause problems. Bumpy tilted his head just slightly, as if considering the statement. Then why did the problems start when you did? Marcus opened his mouth, then closed it. Because there are questions that don't need answers. They expose the truth just by being asked. I'm just trying to get back on my feet, Marcus said finally. Bumpy nodded slowly. Then you picked the wrong way to stand. Marcus's smile faded. For the first time, something real showed in his expression. Not confidence, not control. Something closer to unease. You don't understand what's going on, Marcus said, his voice lower now. Bumpy stepped just a little closer, not threatening, not aggressive, just enough to make sure his words didn't have to travel far. Then help me understand, he said. Marcus hesitated. And in that hesitation, Bumpy saw fear. Not of him, of something else, something bigger. Something Marcus believed he couldn't walk away from. Bumpy's voice softened, not in weakness, but in precision. You didn't come back because you wanted to, he said. You came back because someone sent you. Marcus didn't respond, but he didn't deny it either, and that was enough. Bumpy straightened, his presence calm, unshaken. Tell them this, he said quietly. Harlem isn't something you test. Marcus swallowed. And if they don't? Listen, he asked. Bumpy's expression didn't change. They will. He turned then, walking away with the same steady pace he had arrived with, leaving Marcus standing in the doorway between two worlds, the one he had chosen, and the one he had never truly escaped. Inside the restaurant, conversation slowly resumed. Outside, the city continued to move, but something had shifted again. Not fear this time. Something else. Awareness. Because now, the truth was no longer hidden. The man who had disappeared hadn't just returned, he had been sent. Bumpy Johnson had just made it clear this time. Harlem was ready. Harlem no longer felt like it was waiting. It felt like it knew. There's a difference between fear and awareness, and the neighborhood had crossed that line without anyone announcing it. People still moved carefully, still chose their words with intention, still watched the streets with that quiet caution they had learned over years, but something deeper had settled beneath it all. Not panic, not anger. Clarity. And clarity, Bumpy Johnson understood, was far more dangerous to those who relied on confusion to control others. The days following his encounter with Marcus Halley unfolded with a tension that didn't spike, it stretched. Like a wire pulled tighter and tighter, humming just beneath the surface, threatening to snap but never quite breaking. Incidents continued, but they changed in tone. Less public humiliation, more subtle pressure. Fewer displays meant to scare, more quiet attempts to unsettle. It was as if whoever stood behind Marcus had realized something important. Harlem was watching now. And worse, Harlem was thinking. Bumpy sat in the same office, but the room felt different. Not heavier, sharper. Every detail mattered now. Every decision carried weight beyond the immediate moment. Dutch stood near the window this time, his reflection blending with the city outside, his calm presence as steady as ever. "He's stalling," Dutch said, referring to Marcus. Bumpy nodded slightly. "Because he's trying to survive both sides." Dutch glanced at him. "You think he will?" Bumpy didn't answer right away. He picked up a small notebook from the desk, flipping it open to a page filled with names, not written hastily, not scribbled, but carefully placed as if each one carried responsibility. "Depends," Bumpy said finally, "on whether he remembers what survival actually means." Dutch studied him for a moment. "And if he doesn't?" Bumpy closed the notebook gently. "Then he'll learn." There was no threat in the words, just certainty. That evening, the city offered its next piece of truth, not through force, not through confrontation, but through something far more revealing. Invitation. Marcus Halley sent word. Not directly, of course. Men like Marcus didn't move directly anymore, not after what they had done, not after what they had become. The message came through careful channels, passed hand to hand until it reached exactly where it was meant to go. A meeting, neutral. Ground. Public, enough to discourage anything reckless. Private, enough to keep it contained. Restaurant, table 7. Bumpy read the message once, then folded it without reaction. Dutch watched him. "You expected this?" Bumpy placed the paper down. "I expected a choice." Dutch tilted his head slightly. "And this is it?" "No," Bumpy said. "This is him deciding how much truth he's willing to face." Dutch gave a faint nod. "You going?" Bumpy adjusted his cuff, his movements slow, precise. "Yeah," he said. "But not for him." The restaurant wasn't unfamiliar. It was the kind of place that tried to look refined without understanding what refinement actually was. Dim lighting, heavy curtains, polished wood that reflected just enough to make people feel important. Conversations that stayed low, not out of respect, but out of calculation. It was a place where people pretended control, which made it the perfect place to lose it. Bumpy entered first. Not dramatically, not quietly, just present. The room felt him before it acknowledged him. A subtle shift, a pause in movement. Not fear, something more complicated. Recognition. Dutch followed a step behind, his presence like a shadow that didn't hide, but didn't demand attention. Other calm, composed, the kind of man who didn't need to speak to be understood. Table 7 sat near the center of the room. Marcus was already there. He looked different. Not weaker. Not stronger. Just strained. Like a man who had spent too many nights thinking about choices he couldn't undo. He stood as Bumpy approached, forcing a controlled smile. "Glad you came," Marcus said. Bumpy took his seat without rushing. Dutch remained standing for a moment, then sat as well, his posture relaxed but deliberate. "I didn't come for comfort," Bumpy said. Marcus's smile faded slightly. "I figured." A waiter approached, hesitant. "Anything to drink?" He asked. Bumpy didn't look at the menu. Water, he said. Dutch nodded. Same. Marcus waved his hand. Whiskey. The waiter left quickly, grateful for the excuse to move. Silence settled over the table. Not awkward, not empty, heavy. Marcus leaned forward slightly. You don't understand what's happening, he began. Bumpy met his gaze evenly. Then explain it. Marcus hesitated, because explanation meant admission. And admission meant consequence. They're not just testing Harlem, Marcus said finally. They're restructuring it. Bumpy's expression didn't change. Who? Marcus glanced. Around the room, not dramatically, not obviously, but enough to reveal something important. Fear. Not of Bumpy, of being heard. They don't operate like before. Marcus continued. No names, no faces, just influence, pressure, systems. Dutch spoke for the first time, his voice smooth. Systems still have people behind them. Marcus looked at him, then back at Bumpy. They think this place needs control, he said. Order. They believe if they push hard enough, long enough, people will adjust. Bumpy leaned back slightly, his hands resting calmly on the table. And you? He asked. Marcus swallowed. I told you, he said. I'm trying to survive. Bumpy studied him for a long moment. Then he said something that shifted the entire room, though no one else realized it yet. Survival isn't staying alive, Bumpy said quietly. It's deciding what kind of man you are while you do it. Marcus's eyes flickered, because that wasn't an argument. It was a mirror. The drinks arrived. Water. Whiskey. Marcus picked up his glass, taking a slow sip as if it might steady something inside him. They're watching this place, he said, lowering his voice. Not just this room. The neighborhood, patterns, leaders. Bumpy didn't react outwardly, but inwardly something aligned. They sent you back, he said. Marcus didn't answer, didn't need to. And you gave them names, Bumpy continued. Routines. Weak points. Marcus's hand tightened slightly. Around the glass. I didn't have a choice, he said. Bumpy leaned forward now, just enough to shift the energy. There's always a choice, he said. Marcus shook his head, frustration breaking through. Not like this. Bumpy's gaze sharpened, not with anger, but with precision. Then show me. Marcus blinked. What? Show me where the choice disappears, Bumpy said. Marcus opened his mouth and stopped, because he couldn't. Because the truth, when stripped of excuses, didn't support him. The room seemed quieter now, not because people stopped talking, because something at table 7 had changed, the balance. Marcus reached into his coat slowly. Dutch's eyes flicked to the movement, not alarmed, just aware. From inside the coat, Marcus pulled out something wrapped in cloth. He placed it on the table, unfolded it. A straight razor. The light caught its edge, reflecting something sharp, something final. Not waved. Not used. Present. I didn't come unprepared, Marcus said, his voice low. Bumpy didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't even look at the razor immediately. When he finally did, it wasn't with fear. It was with understanding. You brought that for me? Bumpy asked calmly. Marcus hesitated. No, he said. Bumpy nodded slightly. I know. Because the razor wasn't about Bumpy. It was about Marcus, about the man he had become, about the distance between who he was and who he could have been. Bumpy reached into his own coat. Marcus tensed slightly. But what Bumpy pulled out wasn't a weapon. It was papered. Folded. Ordered. Intentional. He placed it gently on the table. Marcus frowned. What is that? Bumpy opened it. Names. Dates. Records. Connections. Not guesses. Not accusations. Truth. You think you're the only one who kept track? Bumpy said quietly. Marcus's face changed, not dramatically, but enough to reveal something real. You don't understand what you're holding, Marcus said. Bumpy met his gaze. "No," he said. "You don't understand what you've been part of." Silence, deeper now. The razor sat between them, the paper beside it. Two paths. Two choices. Bumpy slid the paper slightly closer to Marcus. "You don't fix this with fear," he said. "You fix it with truth." Marcus looked at the documents. Then at the razor. Then at Bumpy. And in that moment, everything he had been avoiding came into focus. This wasn't about survival anymore. It was about accountability. "You want me to turn on them?" Marcus said. Bumpy shook his head slightly. "I want you to stop turning on yourself." That line landed, not loudly. But completely. Marcus's hand trembled, not from fear of Bumpy, but from the weight of realization. The razor suddenly looked small. Insignificant. Almost embarrassing. Slowly Marcus pushed it away, not dramatically, not as a surrender to Bumpy, but as a rejection of what it represented. The room didn't erupt. No one clapped. No one spoke. But something shifted. Something real. Bumpy nodded once, then slid a pen across the table. "Start here," he said. Marcus stared at it. This was the moment. Not loud, not violent, but decisive. The kind of moment that changes everything quietly. After a long pause, Marcus picked up the pen. And signed. One line, then another. Each signature, not just a confession, but a correction. Bumpy stood. Dutch followed. No celebration. No victory. Just completion. As they walked away, the room parted slightly, not out of fear, but out of something deeper. Respect. Because what had just happened wasn't power in the way people expected. It was something rarer. Control without force. Justice without destruction. And at table 7, where a razor had once promised chaos, silence had rewritten the ending. The most powerful moment is not when a man is defeated, but when he chooses to become something better. The night after table 7 did not end with noise. There were no sirens cutting through the streets, no whispers turning into panic, no sudden storm of consequences rushing in to claim what had been set in motion. Harlem, in its own quiet way, chose not to react. It chose to absorb. And that, more than anything, was what made the moment powerful. Because when a neighborhood that has known nothing but pressure decides not to fracture, not to scatter, not to retaliate in chaos, but to stand still and understand, that is when real change begins to take shape. By morning, nothing looked different, and yet everything was. The streets still carried their usual rhythm, but there was a steadiness now, a grounding that hadn't been there before. People walked with a little less hesitation. Conversations held a little more certainty. It wasn't loud enough to be called victory, but it was undeniable. The kind of shift that doesn't need to announce itself because it's already being felt. Bumpy Johnson noticed it before anyone said a word. He stood once again by the window, that same familiar position where Harlem revealed itself in pieces only he seemed to fully understand. But this time, he wasn't searching for tension. He was measuring its absence. Dutch Schultz entered quietly, closing the door behind him with the same calm precision that defined everything he did. He didn't speak immediately. He didn't need to. He simply stood there for a moment, observing Bumpy, observing the city, understanding that whatever had happened at that table had not ended there. "It's quieter," Dutch said finally. Bumpy nodded. "Not empty," he replied. "Just settled." Dutch stepped closer to the window. "You think it's over?" Bumpy didn't answer right away. Because men like him didn't believe in over, they believed in consequences. And consequences had a way of arriving on their own time. "Nothing ends in one night," Bumpy said. "But something did change." Dutch studied him. "Marcus?" Bumpy turned slightly, his expression still composed, still unreadable. But there was something different now. Not relief. Not satisfaction, resolution. "He made a choice," Bumpy said. "Now he has to live it." Across Harlem, that choice was already beginning to ripple, not loudly, not in ways that drew attention, but in the spaces where power used to move unchecked. The next time an officer considered stopping a man for no reason, something paused him, not fear, but awareness. The next time a complaint was filed against a shop owner who had done nothing wrong, it didn't move as easily through the system. The next time someone tried to apply quiet pressure where it didn't belong, they found resistance, not from one man, but from something larger. Truth had entered the room, and once it did, it didn't leave quietly. Marcus Halle, for his part, did not disappear again. That would have been easier. That would have been expected. But easier wasn't the road Bumpy had placed in front of him. The harder road, the one that required him to stand in the same place he had once abandoned, to face the same people he had once betrayed, to rebuild something that couldn't be. Bought or forced, that was the road that remained. And for the first time in 11 years, Marcus walked it. Not confidently, not comfortably, but honestly. He started with the people who had been hurt the most. No speeches, no explanations that tried to excuse what had been done. Just acknowledgement, just presence. Just the quiet understanding that some things don't get fixed, they get carried. And Harlem watched, carefully, not with immediate forgiveness, but with something else. Judgment. The kind that doesn't come from anger, but from memory. And slowly, something unexpected began to happen. Not acceptance, not yet, but recognition. Because a man who runs is one thing. A man who returns and stays, knowing what he has to face, that is something else entirely. Bumpy didn't interfere. He didn't guide Marcus through it. He didn't protect him from the weight of what he had chosen. Because redemption, if it was going to mean anything, had to stand on its own. Instead, Bumpy focused on what mattered most: the neighborhood, the balance, the quiet strength that had been tested and had not broken. Days turned into weeks, and Harlem adjusted. Not back to what it had been, but forward to something stronger. The small humiliations didn't disappear overnight, but they lost their confidence. The systems that had operated without question began to hesitate, not because they had changed their nature, but because they had been exposed. And exposure, Bumpy knew, was one of the most powerful forms of resistance. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the city in that familiar mix of gold and shadow, Bumpy and Dutch walked together down the street. No destination, no urgency, just movement. You ever think about how close it gets? Dutch asked. Bumpy glanced at him. Close to what? Dutch exhaled lightly. Everything going the other way. Bumpy considered that for a moment. Every day, he said. Dutch nodded. And yet, it didn't. Bumpy's gaze moved across the street, watching the group of kids laughing, unaware of how much had almost been taken from them. No, he said, it didn't. They walked in silence for a while, not empty silence, the kind that carries understanding. Finally, Dutch spoke again. You could have handled that differently, he said, at the restaurant. Bumpy didn't ask what he meant, he knew. You didn't, Dutch continued. You chose restraint. Bumpy stopped walking, not abruptly, just enough to mark the moment. Restraint isn't weakness, he said. It's control. Dutch gave a faint smile. Most people don't see it that way. Bumpy looked back down the street, his expression calm, steady. That's why most people don't lead. They continued walking. And Harlem continued. Breathing, not perfectly, not without struggle, but with something stronger than before, dignity, because in the end, that was what had been restored, not through force, not through fear, not through chaos, but through something far more difficult. Choice. At table 7, a man had been given one. And he had taken it. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough. And sometimes, enough is where everything begins. As night settled over the city, the lights flickered on one by one, illuminating streets that had seen too much and yet still refused to surrender. Somewhere in the distance, music played soft, steady, unbroken. Bumpy paused once more before heading inside. He didn't look for confirmation. He didn't search for validation. He simply observed. And in that observation, he understood something that few men ever truly grasp. Power isn't proven in the moments where you can destroy. It's proven in the moments where you choose not to. Dutch stopped beside him, following his gaze. Quiet. Night, Dutch said. Bumpy nodded. Yeah, he replied. And then, after a brief pause, he added, let's keep it that way. The strongest legacy is not fear. It is the peace you leave behind.